Well, good afternoon everyone and welcome to today's Ruby webinar on the recent federal budget with our special guest Bessa Derda, Chief Economist for the St George Banking Group. My name's Bronwyn Lawson and I'm from Westpac's Davidson Institute and I'll be your host throughout today's webinar. Now before I get started though, let me say a huge welcome to you all to the Ruby webinar series. So for those of you who are new to Ruby, let me tell you a little bit more about us. Westpac has backed Australian women from day one. Nearly 200 years ago, we had Australia's first female bank customer, bank teller, and the first woman as CEO. We were the first bank to dedicate a unit specifically to the success and development of Australian women, and we call it Ruby. So Ruby is a platform designed for women to educate and be educated, to gain support and give it, and to help each other prosper and succeed. We want all women to know they can be part of the Ruby community. No matter what you do, where you are, or who you bank with, we provide an opportunity for all Australian women to support and learn from each other. Our website, rubyconnection.com.au, makes that possible. It provides members with inspirational articles, case studies, learning tools, plus opportunities for self-promotion and connecting with other like-minded Australian women, all in an online environment to suit even the busiest schedule. So I'd really encourage you, if you're not already a member, log on and become a member with the Ruby Connection. Now Ruby regularly partners with Westpac's Davidson Institute to bring you financial education webinars. So the Davidson Institute is Westpac's financial education team. They provide online learning opportunities to help build your financial confidence. And we have some great topics coming up in the coming months, but today's webinar really is a very special event, so we're really happy to have Bessa here with us. Now, for those of you who haven't joined us for a webinar before, let me just tell you how we run. So with so many people joining us today, it can be noisy in the background, so all participants have been placed into listen-only mode. However, it is a live webinar and we do encourage you to ask questions. So the way you can do that is via the questions panel. Now, if you're on a computer, that's most likely a little drop-down box over probably on the right-hand side of your screen. If you're on a mobile device, it'll be a little question mark either at the top or the bottom of your screen. So type your questions in there as you think of them, and then at the end of the presentation, Bessa will come back and answer those for you. Now, there's a lot of information on this next page, but basically what it boils down to is that today's information is general in nature and doesn't in any way constitute advice on your personal situation. So, without further ado, I would like to welcome our very special guest today. So, welcome along, Bessa. Thank you for joining us. And to very ably interview Bessa, to draw out all her wonderful knowledge, we have got Louise Upton with us, who's the editor for Ruby Connection. So, I will hand you over to Louise and Bessa now, and come back at the end to facilitate the questions panel.
Thank you, Brian.
Hi, Bessa.
Hi, Louise.
So I thought we'd start with a little bit about you. I know for me, and perhaps it's also the case for some of our webinars out there today, that I hear the words federal budget and can feel quite overwhelmed. What makes you so excited by it, and how on earth did you get into economics? It's not something I sort of think about, although I did have a cousin who did it.
Well, I guess the federal budget is the one time of the year where all the focus is on economists. So we pour over a 300-plus page document and don't get to leave work till 3 a.m. If you find that exciting, then perhaps you've got a career in economics. But believe it or not, we do find the budget very exciting. How did I get into economics? Look, when I was in high school, I really loved economics, had a great economics high school teacher, and I loved maths. So I saw that being as a perfect combination to go into, I guess, undertaking an economics degree, and from there I joined a graduate program in Colonial, and my last stint was in the economics department. It was a very small team, so I was able to put my fingers into lots of different pies, which I guess as a very junior person, it's quite exciting.
And on that note, you were very young when you were appointed the chief economist at St George, which is not to say that youth is not a problem. What has that meant for your career, and how exciting was that to you?
Yeah, I mean, it was very exciting to me because it gave me the opportunity to, I guess, guide a team and also be measured by my own forecasts and not necessarily have to go out and do presentations where you're following the house forecasts, but you don't always, I guess, believe in those house forecasts. So I guess I could shape the team and shape what we produce and liaise in terms of our client contact.
And when it comes to your career, have you got any sort of particular things that you've learnt from mentors, or has there been a philosophy that you've stuck by?
Yeah, look, I always just try to do a very good job at what I'm doing, and I also think that relationship building or networking is very important. You never really know whether the person you work, like in my job at St George Bank, interestingly, when I was appointed chief economist, it was someone that vouched for me that I'd previously worked with, but hadn't worked with very much. And as the last person I'd ever think of as being someone that would be someone that would recommend me to the organisation, but that's what happened. And I guess that suggests that you don't really know who the person is going to be that is important in your career. So make a good impression always, and that's part of, I guess, working hard and networking and relationship building. And you probably need luck in there as well.
Luck. I think you've actually said you can't do much about luck, but you can improve the other things.
Yeah, that's right.
So many of us have personal and family budgets, and we all know what happens when they go awry. Is the federal budget really any different, and why is it important to the economy? I mean, why should we care about the federal budget? Because I do think that for many of us it's like, oh, I'm just going to put my hands over my head and go away.
Well, the federal budget is the economy's household budget, and the economy is made up of lots of many households, and we are part of that economy. So to put it in layman terms, I guess, the federal budget is the means by which government changes levels of tax and government spending to essentially influence demand in the economy. And government spending, of course, can include things like spending on welfare, education or health. There's lots of things, but they're among the key ones. And when you change demand in the economy, you influence how much people spend, whether that's a consumer or whether that's a business, and therefore you're influencing economic activity and the growth rates of the economy. And in this way, you're then also changing inflation, you're also changing interest rates, and you're also potentially changing the value of the currency. So how do you see that in everyday life? For example, the price of everyday items on the supermarket shelves, that comes from or forms part of inflation. The price of your overseas trips, that's governed by the price of the currency. And our mortgage rates, they're all examples that can be indirectly impacted by changes that come through in the federal budget that then change demand in the economy.
So, what are the key themes in this year's budget? For some of us who are out there, the webinars that are on this, they'll know, but it's good, I think, for us to hear what Bessa thinks is, the key themes.
Well, my catchphrase for this year's federal budget was tax and build. That was because the biggest theme was infrastructure spending, which the federal budget implicitly suggested is the holy grail for everything. And that's all about largely building rail and other transportation projects. So the government really sees infrastructure as the government's answer to everything. That's jobs, that's economic growth, that's productivity, and we can probably throw the kitchen sink in there as well. And the government, for the first time, separated capital spending from recurrent spending. And before I lose everyone when I use those terms, capital spending is essentially infrastructure spending, and recurrent spending is spending on everyday items like welfare, education and health. But the importance of reframing the budget in this way underscores the emphasis the government is placing on infrastructure. Indeed, the government announced $75 billion worth of infrastructure spending over the next 10 years. The key projects were the Western Sydney Airport and the Melbourne to Brisbane Inland Rail project, which runs from Victoria through regional areas of New South Wales and all the way up to Queensland.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
Now, the two key surprises in this year's budget, in my opinion, were the levies, which is why I'm calling it tax and build. Build is the infrastructure bit, and obviously the levies is the tax bill. Levy is just a nice way of saying tax. We had a big problem with levies a few years ago, but this year it seems to have been able to creep through. Anyway, there is an increase in the Medicare levy from 2 to 2.5%, which is effective from 1 July 2019, and there's also a levy on the major banks from 1 July this year. It's probably worth adding that there was also a temporary budget levy, which was an additional 2% on the top marginal tax rate for those earning a taxable annual income above $180,000, which will expire. And the other key themes in the budget that were fairly dominant were around education and housing. Now, we can't go past the bottom line, Louise.
Yeah.
So that is the underlying cash deficit.
Right.
So if you like, when we get our bank balance,
Mm-hmm.
what we forecast that to be in 2017, 2018.
Right.
Similar thing, what's the government forecasting their cash balance will be for 2017, 2018, and that number is $29.4 billion. So that's the big number we're all focusing on. To put that number into perspective, it's the 10th consecutive budget deficit.
Mm-hmm.
It's an improvement on last year's
Mm-hmm.
budget deficit, which you can see from the chart, but it is a deterioration on earlier estimates. Now, the government's still committed to returning the budget deficit back to a surplus in 2020, 2021. So remember a couple of years ago, Tony Abbott saying it's a budget emergency, we're going to get back to a budget surplus. So
Yes.
they've backed themselves into a corner and they're staying committed to returning it to a surplus in 2020-21. Will that happen?
Yes.
Depends on the inputs into that bottom line. And among the key inputs are economic inputs.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the big one is wages growth,
Mm-hmm.
because that's a big chunk of taxation revenue, which then feeds into the bottom line.
Yep.
Now, wages growth in Australia is weakening.
Yeah.
It's at a record low pace. It's sub 2%.
I know. I had trouble getting milk the other day.
And the government, however, sees a sharp turnaround in wages growth.
Okay.
And a spike back up to 3.75% by 2021. Now, it's difficult at seeing that come to fruition,
Yeah. I was
given
going to
that
say.
they're also only forecasting a very modest decline in the unemployment rate.
Mm.
So that means the surplus could prove elusive, or the timing of the surplus,
Uh-huh.
or other measures are coming in coming years. So
you're sort of intimating that will we get back to surplus? Dependent.
that's right.
Yeah. And is debt always bad?
It isn't always bad.
Or doesn't-
I guess we've been led to believe it's bad, we've got to get back to a surplus by a particular time period. None of that is necessarily true. So, in theory, we run budget surpluses when economic times are good,
Yes.
and we run budget deficits when economic times are bad. Now, in terms of getting back to a surplus over time, what we economists like to see is a good strategy in place to get us eventually back into a surplus. The timing, specific timing, isn't that important, but the strategy itself is important.
Yeah.
And part of the reason why it's important is because Australia gets rated by sovereign credit rating agencies.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're currently in an elite club where we're rated AAA, but we do have an agency, Standard & Poor's, that's got us on negative watch.
Right.
So that means we are at a risk of a downgrade.
Yeah. Yeah.
If we get downgraded, it means that what financial institutions have to borrow at will rise in terms of the interest rate. And that could be more of a problem
Yes.
if there was a shock in the global economy or if there was a liquidity crisis.
Yeah.
Past examples, GFC, for instance.
Yeah. Yeah. So What in the budget and the economy do you think could hit the hip pockets of women when it comes to their family and businesses?
Yes, so I'll start with the bad news first, and I've just picked up 2 pluses. Sorry, 2 negatives for the bad news, and then I'll cover 2 pluses.
Yep.
But it's a huge document, the federal budget, so I can't cover what it means for every woman out there, but there's certainly lots of measures. But I'll just cover some of the key ones. And I guess first up, which I've already touched on, is the Medicare levy. The increase from 2 to 2.5% is really like an increase in your personal income tax, because when you put your tax return in, you will be paying more tax in the form of the Medicare levy. Now, the low income thresholds are also increasing, but they're only moving up by a little bit. So it means the net effect is that you'll still be paying more tax.
Right.
Now, women still dominate part-time work, and they're still overrepresented among lower income earners. So I pulled out the latest wages data before I came here.
Oh, yes.
So women earn around $940 a week, and men earn around $1,400 a week. Now, that's quite a large gap. When you put that in annual terms, it's about 48,000 versus 73,000.
Yeah.
With some rounding there. And research shows that those on lower income do spend more of their income on necessary items like groceries, electricity, water bills, etc. So having to pay more tax leaves less money on the essentials, and also, I guess, on discretionary spending. So that's one area that the budget's hit women on. The other area is higher education. So there's a package of reforms announced for education, both for primary schools, which were a big winner. That's the so-called Gonski 2.0. But there are also a lot of measures announced for higher education. It means students will be paying higher fees, 7.5% more in fees, but phased over the next 4 years. Students will have to pay back loans sooner, although at a slightly lesser rate. Now, whilst education is equally important whether you're female or male, you could argue that, you know, bringing about greater gender equity at work starts with greater gender equity in the education. And we have seen more women being educated at the tertiary level, but certainly if it becomes more expensive to do so,
then it may become...
Then it becomes harder to achieve that equity.
Yeah.
So I guess they're the 2 negatives I've pulled out. In terms of the pluses, childcare is a big winner, $37 billion over 3 years from July to be allocated to about 1 million families, and the single means tested childcare subsidy to be replaced with the previous childcare benefits and rebates. And families that are earning $185,710 or less and who need to use more childcare will no longer face an annual cap, as they previously were. Those that earn more than that amount will have their childcare rebates capped at $10,000. Now, parents of preschool-aged children will keep their guaranteed 15 hours a week of free access if they're not working, but if they're not preschool aged, it gets cut to 12 hours, so that suggests there's a lower value placed on working, I guess, mums that stay at home, and research still shows that the parent that stays at home is a woman, and women still do more of the housework. And I guess the losers are wealthy families, so childcare subsidies cut off once they earn more than $350,000 a year. Then there's superannuation. So prior to 2016-2017, super was quite a tax-effective structure for wealthy people, but without getting into all of the nuts and bolts, of which there are many, it's less effective now for high-income earners to use the super system to reduce tax, and there are also limits to the degree they can do that. In this way, the measures reduce the bias in the super system to high-income earners and thereby improve the gender equity of the super system.
And with the asset depreciation extension, is that helpful, do you think, for women who are running their own businesses, certainly small to medium enterprises, the 20,000?
Yeah, so in my trips around New South Wales in the wake of the budget, when I was giving my talks, certainly what was a really big question that kept coming up was about the plant and depreciation measures.
Oh, okay. Yep.
Is that what you?
Well, I'm thinking of the immediate asset depreciation, the $20,000.
For the small business.
Yeah, for small.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yes.
Yeah.
That clearly does help small business.
Yeah.
And small to medium enterprises are about 90% of all businesses in Australia. So any measures that can help small business is a big plus, particularly when business spending in the wider economy has been quite sluggish to date and has been something that's been keeping overall economic growth below potential, below that sweet spot.
And what is that sweet spot, and why do you think we're sort of hanging back on it a little?
Yeah, so I tend to fall back to car analogies when I talk about sweet spots.
Economics and cars.
Yeah, and I'm not a good driver, so I'm not sure why I use those analogies, but anyhow. But if you think about the manual gearbox, gear 1 up to gear 5, the sweet spot is gear 4 or gear 5. You're driving along the country road, it's a sweet spot, you're driving smoothly. The economy is certainly not in sweet spot, but nor is it in gear 1 or gear 2 where the engine is sputtering. I liken it to being in gear 3, where we are growing. In fact, shortly, when the new GDP numbers come out, we will equal the world's record for the longest economic expansion ever. So that's a big tick to the Australian economy. But we're doing that while growing at a moderate pace and growing below potential. And we're growing below potential because we've just come off a once-in-a-century mining investment boom. We're unwinding from that, which leaves a gap in the economy that needs to be filled from other areas. We're filling it a bit with residential construction, a little bit with household consumption, although household consumption's been weakening, but it still leaves a little bit of a gap behind, which means this transition from mining investment to more diversified areas of the economy is leaving us growing below potential.
And in your opinion, what could people do, what could we do about that if we wanted to see the economy grow further and faster? I mean, should we go out and all buy a new pair of shoes?
Household consumption is about 55% of gross domestic product. Gross domestic product is how we measure economic activity. So if we're all spending more when we hit the shopping malls, then yes, we will actually help lift the growth rate of the economy. And what feeds into our spending activity is the shape of the labour market, and it's also confidence. The Reserve Bank often refers to animal spirits, and what they mean is if we're overly confident about the future, then we're more likely to spend, and that can feed in on itself. And I guess where we have seen confidence improve quite a bit over the last few years is, or rather the last year or so, is business confidence has improved to 7-year highs, but we're not necessarily seeing that translate to significantly higher business spending.
Wow. So that would be unusual.
Well, it is unusual to see confidence, I guess,
not played out on.
Not played out on, But it means it could come, but it also would help economic activity more broadly if business spending came to the party.
So, and in that case, is the corollary of that there's a lot of saving, and is that any good for us, or is that not what's happening?
Well, we're seeing household debt rise at a time when house prices are growing very strongly in Sydney and Melbourne. Household wealth is also picking up, so often we don't talk about that other side of the equation, but that's important. But with household debt rising and also household prices so strong in both Sydney and Melbourne, even though we're growing below potential, and also inflation's below the RBA's target band, it doesn't necessarily mean the Reserve Bank's going to come in and cut the cash rate again in order to stimulate economic activity. And that's where the federal budget is important. Because if the RBA's hands are tied to some extent and the economic activity is growing below potential, then the government might need to do more to stimulate economic activity. And infrastructure is certainly one way of doing that, because the government is spending more on infrastructure projects, which means more construction, more jobs. If people have more jobs, they spend more.
Yes.
They're spending more. There's more momentum that feeds through to the broader economy.
Yeah.
And that's certainly what we're seeing play out in this federal budget in terms of infrastructure spending. But it does take time for infrastructure spending to feed through to growth, because you know, you announce an infrastructure spending plan,
and then you've got to do it.
you've got to do it, and it takes time. As anyone can see around the country, where there are infrastructure spending happening, particularly in New South Wales and Victoria, it takes time for the projects to finish or even start.
And I know you've been doing a lot of presentations on the budget and its implications for the economy and business all around the country. How does that affect you personally? Do you get to go home at this time of year, or do you stay? And I'm imagining if you have children, they don't know who mum is anymore.
Not around budget time. Yeah, so I think we left here at 2:30 in the morning, and we're back at work at 6:30 a.m. to be ready to give talks at 7 a.m. So, like I said, I guess the federal budget is really quite a busy time of year for economists, and you know, it's the one time of the year you really do got to pore over documents and interpret them very quickly. Yeah. And we're always interpreting various data points, but I guess the federal budget being an annual document of the way the government and the economy is shaping up means it's important.
And I know one of the, there's been a few things that people have been asking you about quite a lot in your presentations, and this is like 3 weeks on from the budget now, isn't it? So it's obviously, even though you, as you say, you've got to analyse it and take it in very quickly, you get quite a bit of time to keep talking about it, which is nice for us. What are your thoughts on the budget measure, what is it, the first home buyer measure? I can't apply for that anymore. And how will it help, particularly women?
I'm not sure it would help you, Louise. You live in Sydney.
Yeah, this is a good answer.
With the median house price above $1 million in Sydney, I'm not sure that $30,000 would go very far. So that's one of the problems with that measure. And the measure basically is first home buyers can put money into superannuation at the concessional rates up to $15,000 per year, up to a total of $30,000, then withdraw it later in order to put it towards a first home deposit. Yeah. Now, like I said, house prices have grown very strongly, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, so $30,000 isn't going to go very far. Will it help housing affordability? Not really. It's really just tinkering at the edges. Do we have a housing affordability issue? Well, if you look at the slide, on the left-hand side, what you can see is the average amount of wages, the median household wage that you need to put aside to purchase the median house in Sydney and Melbourne. And I've just selected Sydney and Melbourne because they're the two cities that are on the radar for the Reserve Bank. Yeah, so even if you don't live in Sydney or Melbourne, it's an issue for you because it's impacting the Reserve Bank's decision around interest rates, and also feeding into what the government is doing in terms of housing policy. Right, yes. So if you have a look at the right-hand side chart, the blue plot for Sydney, it's 10.5 times and growing. So that highlights to you the difficulty that a first home buyer has in buying their first home. So they need to put aside 10.5 times their household income in order to buy the median house. And it's a ratio that's been rising quite rapidly over the last few years. So housing affordability wasn't really addressed in a concrete way in the federal budget, but it's also a very complex issue that is not solved easily. And a lot of the price growth that we have seen, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, has a lot to do with the fact that interest rates are incredibly low. The population is growing strongly. And in Sydney, we didn't build anything for about 10 years. And then we've tried to play catch up in recent years, but we've still got a shortage of dwellings.
So from some of my reading, is that shortage of dwellings in houses and units, or is there apartments, or is there a sort of difference in those two markets? I'm not quite sure whether you're...
Yeah, well, in New South Wales, we look at it on a net basis. So on a net basis, it's in shortage.
Mm-hmm.
Every other capital city this year, however, is in small oversupply.
Right.
So
small oversupply being the apartment.
Mainly apartments, but on a net basis, apartments and housing.
Okay.
So that means there's greater vulnerability for those other capital cities, particularly since APRA has widened supervisory measures. And there are also some measures in this federal budget that will also dampen housing demand somewhat. For example, there were changes to plant depreciation, which I thought you were asking me about, and also there were also some measures directed to foreign buyers. So, for example, foreign buyers can now only buy up to 50% of a new housing development, and there's also the ghost tax. So, if a foreign buyer buys a home, leaves it empty for more than 6 months, then they get hit with the tax. So some of those measures will dampen demand, and we're already seeing a bit of a slowing occurring in housing prices and lending, so we can expect a further slowing to come. Whether a place like Sydney will slow enough remains to be seen.
Well, I think that's probably enough from me with Bessa, and we might go to some questions that have come in from the audience, which means I'm going to throw back to Bronwyn, who will take us from there.
So amazing, Bessa. Thank you so much for that. And we have got a couple of questions that have come through from our audience. So the first one's come through from Bryony, and Bryony's asked, is the desire to keep our credit rating status holding us back from investment that could in fact increase the speed of the economy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I guess it's up to the federal government to decide where best to direct spending. So there's a big emphasis, as I've mentioned, in infrastructure spending, which, if you select those projects well, should foster jobs growth, should foster an improvement in productivity, should foster greater economic growth. Now, the government's called essentially infrastructure spending good debt, which isn't entirely accurate because you can still get a white elephant with an infrastructure project. And also, spending on education, health and welfare isn't necessarily bad debt, and both forms of debt need to be paid for. So it's really up to the government to balance its spending and determine where best to get its revenue in order to decide the best available policy, I guess, for the economy. The sovereign credit rating is important because if you are on lower ratings, it means that it does feed through to higher borrowing costs for financial institutions. And in economic times of difficulty, that can become a greater problem. Having said that, though, Australia is in a club of 16 countries, very elite club. So even if we lost AAA and moved to the next credit rating, we'd still be relatively quite high up compared to other countries around the world.
Oh, yeah. Excellent. Now, another question we've had come through here, and for everybody on the line, if you do have a question, please type it into your questions panel now so that Bessa can answer that for you. Now, I've got one here. A very emotive part of the budget was also around the increase in university fees and HECS. So questions come through, do you think HECS for a uni student is a good option? And as a uni student, once I get back in the workforce, how quickly should I actually try and pay it off?
Well, it depends how you view debt, I guess, and it depends on your, I guess, I call it your appetite for risk. So if you have a low appetite for risk, you might want to pay off your debt sooner. If you have a stronger appetite for risk, then you might be more comfortable taking longer to pay it off. But the government has deemed that once you earn more than $42,000, you will have to start paying off your debt. Is HECS a good option? I think when they introduce HECS, it is a good option. It means that a university education is available to a wider cross-section of society and is not limited to just those people that can afford to pay, uni fees outright.
Yeah. So, and I think that you hit the nail on the head there. It does come back to your own attitude towards debt, and it is a debt, and if you're looking to borrow from a bank, then they will take that into account as well.
They will. They certainly will. So that will count towards, that will count as an input towards a mortgage application or a personal loan application, because all of that is considered.
Yeah, so exactly. Yeah. And if you've paid your HECS debt off quickly, then that will show that you have a good repayment history, so which is a real positive out of it as well. Yeah. Excellent. All right, just let me have a look at the questions here to see what else we've got. There's one here around investment properties. So I believe there was also some changes around depreciation on investment properties.
That's right. So I think I alluded to that with Louise. And that was a big one, I guess, for a lot of our audiences that were in the accountancy and finance industries. So basically, the government will now limit plant and equipment depreciation deductions to outlays actually incurred by investors. So that means that owners of a property won't be able to claim deductions for plant and equipment purchased by a previous owner. So now it's a little bit unclear as to what that means for off-the-plan properties. So depending on who you talk to, some people will say, well, no, it doesn't apply or it doesn't. But I think if you take the definition strictly, if you buy an investment property off the plan, you can no longer count those fixtures towards plant and equipment depreciation, because the developer has incurred those costs first, not you. And you have to be the one that incurs the cost first. So that can actually impact the demand for new properties, because quite often that plays quite a significant part of the decision of an investor buying a brand new property, because being able to depreciate plant and equipment of a completely brand new property is quite a considerable amount.
Yeah, and it is a big consideration in terms of the quality of the items. Whether it's the washer and the dryer or the dishwasher, the quality of those, and that all comes into the price that you pay for that property as well. Yeah.
And so I also wonder whether we'll go towards a situation that we see in some countries where when they buy off the plan, you pretty much just get a shell. Yeah, you get a shell, and then you fit it out. So maybe these measures might eventually lead to you just buying a shell rather than something that's already fitted out. Because then you'll be incurring the cost first, and then you'll be able to depreciate it.
Yeah. Interesting times ahead.
That's right.
All right. I've got another question here for you, Bessa, and I'm afraid we're not going to get to everybody's questions today, but those that we don't get to answer today, we will come back to you via email probably early next week, because I know Bessa's got a very busy week ahead of us. So, but Bessa, if we can finish with this one from Sibylla, and it's around the first home buyers measures. So she's asked, what are your suggestions for first home buyers in respect to the super tax saving measure, particularly if you live in Sydney?
Well, I think anything that can help a first home buyer is still positive. Obviously, the measures in this year's federal budgets are quite minor, but it's still something. So if you're a first home buyer, you might as well take advantage of that, because it's still something. So use the superannuation vehicle and the concessional tax rates as a way of saving for that first home buyer. Take advantage of it, because it's there to be used. And I guess in this sort of market where, house prices have risen quite substantially, I mean, if you bought a house 5 years ago in Sydney and you sold it today, you'd make it, on average, you'd make 105%. So that just gives you the scale of the capital gains. Is to select the dwelling in this sort of environment carefully. So have a look at transportation links, have a look at schooling links to the suburb you're buying at, have a look at how far it is from the CBD and how far it is from strong jobs networks. Like there's parts of Sydney now that are specialising in the healthcare sector. There's parts, have a look how close it is to the hospitals, and selectively, I guess, choose the dwelling, as you always do, but I think in a market that might be a little bit more vulnerable to house price growth slowing, you have to be more selective.
Yep. And as you say, any help or assistance at all, even if it's a concession from the government, is going to help those first-time buyers, because it's a real challenge.
It's there, so you might as well take advantage of it.
Yeah, yeah.
And this is Louise again, I'm supposing too that this actually helps focus younger people, and especially young women, on their super, which is something that just isn't happening. I mean, it's another thing where a lot of people just close down because they think, well, that doesn't affect me. I'm 26. I'm not 65 or 62.
Can I use my no button?
No!
And your no button means?
Well, when I asked my staff about my philosophy, because I knew you were going to ask me about my philosophy, they said, tell them you never say no. And a colleague that recently left our team left me this no button to use. And so I brought it along because I wanted to use it, because I don't get to use it often. So no, don't ignore superannuation, because it is our retirement savings. We are living longer than ever before, and one of the big risks, which is called longevity risk, is we actually underestimate how long we're going to live and underestimate the savings for what we will need for retirement. So superannuation is something we really should understand and take a more active role in understanding and participating in, and also taking advantage of the vehicle where there are, concessional tax rates. So
the vehicle being that your super does allow you to do certain things that you can't do anywhere else.
And look, it might seem like for the younger generation, it might seem like it is a very far way away, but don't forget.
Quickly.
Remember that. Remember compounding.
Yes.
Is very important and goes a long way to growing money over time.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I'm afraid I am going to have to pull you up there because I know you do have another engagement to get to. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'll wrap today up, but please, I know you'll join me virtually in thanking Bessa very much for her time and expertise today. It's been a real pleasure to hear from her and to really break down something that seems quite complex, but in actual fact is quite simple in how it actually impacts us daily. So, and thank you too to Louise for very ably steering the conversation to ensure that we got the most out of Bessa's time today. But most of all, let me say thank you to you guys for joining our webinar today. I trust you've found the information useful and relevant, and I do encourage you to explore both the Davidson Institute and the Ruby Connection websites, because they've got lots and lots of great information there for you, and particularly to help you become more financially confident. So I'm going to ask you, there's a really quick survey that comes up after the end of the webinar. I'd really appreciate it if you could take a few moments to share your thoughts with us. But again, thank you so much for joining us, and have a great afternoon.